Afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to see you all here. I'm Kathleen Stevens. I'm the chair of the Korea Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a very special event. It would be special in any case because we have an extraordinary panel here today and a very timely subject, U.S. diplomacy and security in Korea. But it's even more special because this is, one, the Korea Society's inaugural, meaning we're going to do it again, but it's our inaugural Van Fleet Policy Signature event, which we scheduled today to be on the afternoon of our board meeting. So we've had a good board meeting to talk about exciting plans ahead for the Korea Society, where we've been over this last year or so. It's good to see all of you. And this afternoon, we wanted to top it off with what is our first in-person policy event since February 2020. So that makes it extremely special, and thank you all for coming. There'll be many introductions to follow for gentlemen who really need no introduction, but I will leave that for later. Right now, my remaining duty is simply to say this is made possible by our good friends and continuing supporters at Hyundai Motor Company. And we're going to hear via video, I think, we're still in somewhat of a Zoom age, from the President of Strategic Planning at Hyundai, President Yong Won Kong, in just a moment. So thank you very much to Hyundai Motor. I know we have some representatives here for their support today and always. And like you, I very much look forward to the discussion, a very lively one today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to join you today from Seoul, Korea. My name is Yong Won Kong, and I am President of Hyundai Motor Company. It is significant that we are all gathered here today, both in person at the Korea Society in New York City and virtually from around the world, including Seoul. The world is more connected than ever before, and the United States and Korea are a shining example of how to develop and build strong relations across the globe. Our two countries have built a close relationship over many decades, and our alliance is made stronger through people like you and organizations like the Korea Society. Hyundai has been a long-time supporter of the Korea Society because we firmly believe in their purpose to promote awareness, understanding, and cooperation between the people in US and Korea. We are inspired and encouraged by their continuing effort to educate the public in the importance of US-Korea relations, to convene dialogue on the diverse issues, and to foster vibrant US-Korea ties. At Hyundai, our vision is always support and contribute toward progress for humanity. We believe humanity unites us and makes us stronger. By believing in the value of humanity, we can strengthen our relationships, feel more connected, and accelerate progress to solve global challenges with joint solutions. What better ways to move toward than to bring people together, just as the Korea Society does every day? Today is a special day as we kick off the Korea Society's inaugural Van Fleet Policy Signature event. It is truly an honor for Hyundai Motor to support the meaningful discussion and to encourage continued dialogue for peace and prosperity. We are fortunate to have an inspiring group of individuals who have dedicated their life to serving their country. Former Ambassador and Admiral Harry Harris, UNC CFC USFK Commander General Robert Abrams, and the Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Scott Swift will sit down with Korea Society Board Director and the former UNC CFC USFK Commander General Walter Skip Sharp to discuss geopolitical security in Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula, and diplomatic challenges and opportunities in the US-Korea alliance. We are delighted to welcome them here today, and congratulations to the Korea Society for organizing this important inaugural event. Once again, it is my distinct privilege to join you, and I look forward to today's conversation as well as future Korea Society events, as well as we all work together toward progress for humanity. Thank you.
I just gave my intro.
Well, I certainly have to thank Hyundai Motors for sponsoring and our inaugural signature policy event, and this is the kickoff for not only that series, which we'll have every year, but for our in-person policy meetings. I just want to put in a plug before I go on. Our next in-person meeting here will be on December 14th. We'll be collaborating with the National Committee for American Foreign Policy. I'm very pleased to see Chairman Jeffrey Schaefer and President Susan Elliott here today. And that'll be a conversation, a global geopolitical view on the Korean Peninsula by Walter Russell Mead, who writes the Global View column in the Wall Street Journal. So I thank the panelists for coming here. It's great to see everybody in person again. Looking forward to return to normal. And it's my honor and great privilege to introduce a friend, but also board director, retired General Walter Skip Sharp. General Sharp was born in Morgantown, West Virginia, while his father was fighting in the Korean War. Skip graduated from West Point in 1974 and has a master's of science degree in operations research and systems analysis from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. General Sharp commanded the United Nations Command, Republic of Korea, United States Combined Forces Command, and the U.S. Forces Korea from 2008 to 2011. Skip also commanded troops in Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Uphold Democracy in Haiti, and the multinational division of the NATO-led stabilization forces in Bosnia. He is a director of the board of the Korea Society, as I mentioned, chairman of the board of the Military Officers Association of America, and the former chairman and president and now special advisor to the Korea Defense Veterans Association. General Sharp is involved in Northeast Asia and Korean strategy and policy discussions at several Washington, D.C. area think tanks, and General Sharp and his wife, Joanne, live in the Washington, D.C. area. Skip, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks. This is exciting, and I really look forward to the discussion today about the Republic of Korea-U.S. alliance, the alliance which I truly believe is the strongest alliance anywhere in the world. This alliance was born out of the Korean War and over the years has continued to grow and strengthen. Immediately following the Korean War in October of 1953, the United States and the Republic of Korea signed their Mutual Defense Treaty. In 1978, Combined Forces Command was established. In 1994, the Republic of Korea assumed operational control of its forces and the day-to-day responsibility of defending South Korea during armistice. South Korea has gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to today, depending upon how you measure it, either the 9th or the 10th richest countries in the world, most prosperous. Today, this alliance faces many challenges, but also has many opportunities to continue to grow and to continue to provide peace, security, freedom, and prosperity in Korea, and really in all of Northeast Asia. Today, we have three distinguished panelists. Admiral Scott Swift, to my right, commanded at all levels, including United States 7th Fleet and United States Pacific Fleet. He participated in combat operations at Southern Watch, Enduring Freedom, and Iraqi Freedom. He's a graduate of San Diego State University, still has a house in San Diego, and also the U.S. Naval War College, and has a master's degree from the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Harry Harris in the center. Admiral Harry Harris commanded the U.S. 6th Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, and the U.S. Pacific Command. He's also served as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's representative to the Secretary of State. And after his retirement, as we all know, he was the ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2018 to 2021. He's a graduate of the Naval Academy. Go Army, beat Navy. Holds a master's degree from Harvard School of Government and Georgetown School of Foreign Service. General Abrams commanded also at every level, led troops in combat operations in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And he was the commander of United States Army Forces Command, and the commander of United Nations Command, Combined Forces Command, and U.S. Forces Korea from 2018 to 2021. So very recently retired out of there. General Abrams holds a Bachelor of Science from the United States Military Academy and a Master of Science from Central Michigan University, and is a graduate of the U.S. Army War College. Our three distinguished panels will start by giving remarks on the role of the Republic of Korea-U.S. alliance, not only in Korea, but also in Northeast Asia. Challenges and opportunities for peace, security, and freedom all across the region. They will examine and speak about both the military and the diplomatic roles of the alliance and how they need to work together to face the challenges of today and into the future. Challenges and opportunities in an era of strategic competition that affect every country in Asia and beyond. Challenges such as North Korea, and opportunities to get to a denuclearized North Korea that believes in freedom and human rights. Challenges and opportunities on how to strengthen the alliance through working with other regional organizations, transition of wartime operational control, the structure of training and readiness of Combined Forces Command, United States UN Command, Republic of Korea forces, and U.S. forces stationed in Korea. So we will have a good dialogue today. After their initial opening comments, they will respond to questions submitted from our audience here in the Korea Society headquarters and from those watching virtually. For those in the room, you have been provided cards. Somebody show me that, is that true? You have been provided cards to write your questions during the presentation. If you have a question, please just write it out and raise it up, and one of the staff will come by and collect those, and we'll endeavor to answer almost all those questions as we go through. Likewise, for those on the virtual feed, please email your questions to policy@koreasociety.org. Again, that's policy@koreasociety.org. We'll first start with Admiral Swift to look at the region, and then go to Admiral and Ambassador Harris to look at the diplomatic role of the alliance, and then to General Abrams for the role of the military component of the alliance. So with that, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and your all's questions and talking about how to continue to strengthen this great alliance. And Scott, I'll turn it over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Skip. First, I'd like to thank the Korea Society for hosting this, and Skip for you moderating it. Just to give you a little background of our relationship up here. When asked, I jumped at the opportunity of participating in this when Skip reached out to me, even more so when I found out who the other panelists would be. Skip was the commander in Korea when I was the J3 at PACOM. And it really built, because the challenges that we faced at the time, it built a personal relationship beyond just the professional relationship that we had. And that was prior to me going to 7th Fleet. When I left 7th Fleet, I came back to the Pacific as the Pacific Fleet Commander and relieved Harry as the Pacific Fleet Commander, and he immediately became my boss as he promoted up to PACOM. And it's extraordinary what I've learned from these two individuals. Just from those two experiences, our relationship goes much deeper than that. And then having General Abrams sharing the stage up here, having just left Korea, of all of us here, despite our insights, he brings a very sharp, fresh perspective of what's happening now. So it's great to be a part of this. As Skip mentioned, my role is to describe a broader theater construct of the challenges that we face in the region, in particular to the Republic of Korea challenges. That is the center of this Korea Society signature policy event that it's designed to highlight. I want to preface my comments by saying, with respect to my global views, I remain neither a pessimist or an optimist. I consider myself to be a realist. Perhaps this comes from my experience and a practitioner's view of the region. Where I see instability and uncertainty, I also see opportunity. I will say those opportunities will be difficult to leverage unilaterally, a point that I'll underscore later. Before I address examples of these opportunities, I'd like to make 2 points in advocating for a broader, more strategic, and less operational and tactical view of the region. First, the change of characterizing the broad competition elements at play in the region from great power to strategic competition is to be commended, in my opinion. One reason to advocate for this change, while there are ample examples of competition that exist between so-called great powers, they are far from isolated to great power relationships. In fact, there are more examples of non-great power competition in the region. Further, regardless of the stature of powers involved, the most common characteristics of these conflicts and competitions are strategic in nature. Almost all are either wholly or have significant economic elements in them. Almost all have significant governance belief system discontinuity. Almost all have disparate approaches to conflict resolution, such as abandoning the long-held models of strategic friction resolution through discourse and dialogue in favor of force and coercion as more expedient, but as also more broadly disruptive and destabilizing to the region and beyond. This adapting and adopting of models of might makes right in of itself is strategic in nature. Often the application of such approaches comes in the form of using new power to bolster national revanchist views to justifying acting outside the long-established and validated international rules-based system. This is the system at the core of these strategic competitions. Born from the ashes of World War II, its application has resulted in sustained global growth and resultant rising tide of prosperity that has lifted all boats that sail under the protection of the system, regardless of size, stature, wealth, port of origin, or destination. In my view, the term strategic competition is more accurate and holistically characterization of this competition in reflecting it is not exclusive of or to any state. The competition over the mechanisms for the application and modification of the international rules-based order needs to be inclusive of any nation concerned about the tilt to a might makes right philosophy and strategy in the regional domain. Second, while the competition may still be an Indo-Asia-Pacific centric one, it is no longer specific to the region. It is global. The points I just highlighted are present in all continents, fostered by those who have a governance belief that inherently conflicts with the international rules-based system. Because of the inherent weakness of these alternative governance systems, these competitors embrace the asymmetric application of all elements of national sovereign power, often in internationally sovereign space. Under the cloak of opacity, whole of government objectives are often pursued through coercive actions conducted by pseudo-military forces operating under unacknowledged national endorsement and control. They have become so prevalent they've been named, now broadly referred to as gray zone activities, leveraging the concepts of hybrid warfare perfected by Russia in Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. We now see their application well beyond the petri dish of the South China Sea, present in maritime domains of the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, and around Africa. Their application has been noted ashore as well. Is this the model we are to embrace, abandoning the model that has served so many so well for so long? All this sums up to support the case that the great power characterization no longer matches the scope and scale of what the competition has become, as well as the more inclusive characterization of what it is, strategic competition. This is underscored by the cases of malign forces and coercion being applied against both peer and non-peer competitors. With this focus on instability and uncertainty, where are the examples of opportunity I referenced earlier? Quad is one. It was a concept I discussed with various interested partners as early as my service as a 7th Fleet commander. It had more opponents and skeptics than advocates then, but now Quads is real. What changed? AUKUS was an alliance that wasn't a consideration a year ago. And while formed at the great dissatisfaction of France for economic reasons, a key ally to all three members, it continues to grow in strength. Why? What changed? The UK has been largely absent from the Indo-Asia Pacific since the turnover of Hong Kong governance in the late 90s. Now it is back in ways that transcend the deployment of the formidable carrier strike group formed around HMS Queen Elizabeth. This deployment was preceded by a thoughtful, years-long inclusive effort to understand how best to make clear what the UK believed its interest and role was in this strategic competition. Made up of the sustained assignment of a USS DDG, US Marine Corps F-35 fighters, it was regularly attached units from like-minded partners who used their assignment of military units as symbols of their solidarity with a shared established concept of discourse and dialogue to change the international rules-based order, clearly rejecting where force and coercion might be pursued instead. The course and conduct of HMS Queen Elizabeth's deployment was underscored these core beliefs. Sailing in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, Philippine Sea, and East Sea, just to name a few, her transits and engagements have been models of alignment with the international rules-based system, eschewing the potent military power of the strike group in deference to the higher power and value of diplomacy. Here too the question is, what changed? Even the Luftwaffe and the German Navy are in the news of late, seeking opportunities to underscore Germany's concerns about the state of affairs of increased instability and uncertainty in the Indo-Asia Pacific. Why? What changed? France, the holder of the largest EEZ in the Asia Pacific, has been a consistent presence and partner in the Pacific for decades with a consistent naval presence. It's burnishing her historical commitment to the region. This has not changed. What has changed is countries whose governance belief systems were tested and proven in the crucible of World War II are acting today as they did then, drawing together in their common commitment to their shared beliefs though well before strategic competition fails to the point of kinetic conflict. This is reflected in Secretary Austin's continued highlighting the importance of collective deterrence. These examples are of opportunity seized, underscores we are experiencing a much more than a great power competition. That is what has changed. We all have skin in the game, great power or not. It is our combined faith in a system of governance established at the end of World War II with its foundational objective of security applied for the goal of sustained stability that has been the driver behind the global prosperity we have collectively enjoyed for over 75 years. This international rules-based system, the mechanisms designed to implement change, are not perfect. There's a quote attributed to Winston Churchill which seems particularly applicable here. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. No one country can make democracy work. It inherently requires a team effort, nationally and internationally. It works only on the collective commitment of all those who maintain faith in its value. In summary, the problems we face as members of the international community are not unique, regardless of how our stature may be measured. Our approach must be collective and shared. We should be inclusive of our differences, our beliefs, our strengths, and how we characterize them. These were the core strengths of our emergence as individual modern nations. They remain the core strengths we must continue to embrace as we collectively strive to manage the modern world we have created. That collective commitment is a task we all must share. Let us not be late to that task again. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Now focus in on the diplomatic side within the region, specifically Korea, to Harry.
Thanks, and thanks again to Tom Byrne, Kathy Stevens, the Korea Society, and Hyundai for putting this event together. It's quite an honor for me to be on this panel with the likes of Scott Swift and Abrams and the esteemed Skip Sharp, and I hope that you all will ask them the hard questions and save the easy ones for me. So I thought I'd start by giving you the wave tops about some things I've been thinking about lately. First off, COVID. Trend lines are once again pointing in the wrong direction in parts of the United States and Europe. Korea's approach to COVID-19 has been lauded, and rightly so, as a global model. It's not that complicated. Follow the rules and follow the science. Unless you believe that vaccinations will inject a tracking device in your arm, or you get your medical advice from talk radio and your meds from veterinarians. Second, let me say a few words about what happened on January 6th in Washington. Those events reverberate today and affect us diplomatically around the world. We must understand what happened so that it doesn't happen again. The actions of the mob that attacked the U.S. Capitol and attack on U.S. and American democracy itself serve as the sharpest reminder of America's challenges, but also of America's ultimate strength, resilience, and longstanding commitment to democracy. I emphasized to my interlocutors in Seoul before I left last January that Joe Biden is now the 46th President of the United States, and the noble work of the alliance would continue. I expressed my confidence that President Biden and his team will continue to work with leaders there to strengthen the relationship in all its dimensions, not just the security one. Third, it's hard to take the podium these days, rhetorically, virtually, or actually, given my career in the military, without someone mentioning the fall of Afghanistan. So let me just get right to that and save you that question. The President's decision to withdraw was, in my view, the right decision. After all, he campaigned on it, and he was elected. You shouldn't blame an elected official for sticking to his or her campaign promises. You can be surprised, perhaps, but you shouldn't blame them for doing that. However, the execution of the withdrawal was deeply flawed, and someone should be held accountable, in my view. I'll also opine that even though the President inherited a deeply flawed Taliban deal from the previous administration, he not only accepted it, he embraced it, only sliding the end date by a few months. Therefore, he owns it. Bottom line, I've gone through 3 stages of grief so far: shock at how fast Afghanistan collapsed, anguish at the debacle of the pullout, and anger for those killed and left behind. And ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit that I'm stuck on anger. Now, I don't want to give a full-throated speech today. You want to ask questions, and you and I both want to hear from General Abrams. So I'll talk briefly about several topics and wait for the Q&A session. First, the end-of-war declaration, sanctions, and joint military exercises. I'll defer to General Abrams on the military aspects and simply say that the quest for dialogue with the North must never be made at the expense of the ability to respond to threats from the North. Dialogue and military readiness must go hand in hand. Idealism must be rooted in realism. We must not relax sanctions or reduce joint military exercises just to get North Korea to come to the negotiating table. This is a tried and true road to failure. If exercises and sanctions are reduced as an outcome of negotiations, fine. I mean, that's why we have negotiations. But don't give them away beforehand. Regarding the end-of-war declaration, we should ask ourselves what will change the day after that declaration is signed. It's not a peace treaty. The armistice will still be extant. Our treaty obligations to defend South Korea will still be extant, and North Korea's missile, nuclear, and conventional capabilities will still be extant. I always thought we had an end-of-war declaration. It's called the Armistice Agreement. Now, let me talk about the Biden administration's approach to alliances. International relations matter, and alliances matter. The President calls our alliances our greatest asset. The world is growing smaller through a diplomatic, international, military, and economic lens. But folks, I assure you that the United States is fully committed to our alliance with South Korea. This is important because, as you all know and are well aware, North Korea and the PRC, the People's Republic of China, will continually test the resolve of the alliance. and will seek ways to weaken our strong ties in order to sow doubts and divide us. And for those who believe that we're overinvested in Northeast Asia, I'll simply say that that's not true. This is simply not true. What is true is that we're invested in other parts of the Indo-Pacific. Now let me talk about Singapore and the agreement with North Korea. The U.S. continues to seek transform relations between Washington and Pyongyang, lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula, and the complete denuclearization of North Korea, all of which were agreed upon in Singapore in 2018, and will set the conditions for a brighter future for the North Korean people if their leaders and leader will accept that. Now, while I believe that Singapore was not a perfect agreement, it's a good starting point from which to pursue peace on the peninsula. On KGU's objectives, I believe that Kim Jong-un wants four things. He wants sanctions relief, he wants to keep his nukes, he wants to split our alliance with South Korea, and he wants to dominate the peninsula. During last January's 8th Workers' Party Congress, KGU talked about strengthening North Korea's nuclear deterrent. Last March, the IAEA expressed concerns about the trajectory of North Korea's nuclear program, and last May, the U.S. intelligence community formally assessed that KGU views nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent against foreign intervention. Folks, that doesn't sound to me like he wants to give them up anytime soon. Now let me talk about the PRC, the People's Republic of China. I'm often asked whether the ROK, the South Korea, is being forced to choose between its only security ally on the one hand and its largest trading partner on the other. This is a false narrative designed to sow doubt about the history and strength of our alliance. Korea made a choice. It made its choice in 1953, and America made our choice in 1950. While the U.S. has partnered well with China on several important fronts, including most recently at COP26 in Scotland, Washington and Beijing fundamentally disagree on how to approach the current international order. As I testified when I was the PACOM commander, I believe the PRC seeks hegemony not only in East Asia, but beyond. The U.S. has made it very clear through the Indo-Pacific strategy that we reject foreign policies based on leverage and dominance, and we seek instead to strengthen relationships based on respect, equal footing, and fair exchange. The U.S. will not weaponize debt. Now, while the how-to regarding dealing with Beijing will certainly change with the Biden administration, I'm pleased to note that the fundamental understanding of the PRC has not. Now to Taiwan. Secretary Austin testified that he's focused on the pacing threat posed by the PRC, and he promised strong support for Taiwan. Taiwan is democratic, an economic and innovation powerhouse, and a global force for good. I have called for ending the 50-year U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity with regard to Taiwan in favor of a new policy of strategic clarity. Now to Japan. Notwithstanding the current tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, and these are not insignificant, the reality is that no important security or economic issue in the region can be addressed without both South Korea's and Japan's active involvement. I was disappointed the South Korean president did not travel to Tokyo for the Olympics to meet with his counterpart, and that neither had a bilateral meeting during the just completed COP26 conference in Scotland. Not pointing fingers, just opining that these are missed opportunities. With elections in South Korea coming early next year, Seoul, for sure, will be focused internally until then. On the Quad, as Admiral Swift said, I'm a big booster of the Quad. I called for its resurgence at the inaugural Raisina dialogue in New Delhi in 2016. Jake Sullivan has said that it's the foundation upon which to build a substantial U.S. policy in the region. I recently began calling for the establishment of a Quad Secretariat, headquartered somewhere in the region, to coordinate what issues the Quad should take on, and perhaps to also get at the question of how new members can join. If you go back to American college football, the Big Ten has 14 teams, and the Big 12 has 10 teams. There's nothing that says the Quad only has to have 4 teams. But let's be clear, the Quad is not NATO, nor will it ever be a NATO. It's a grouping of like-minded democracies who share an outlook on the region's opportunities, challenges, and dangers. But it is not a defense pact. Now, the new AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK agreement, is a defense pact. And I, for one, am all for it, and I'm excited by it. I cannot wait to see a nuclear submarine under Australian colors underway in the Indo-Pacific. I don't believe this will take decades if the three countries put our hearts, minds, and resources to task. After all, we put a man on the moon in 8 years, and we developed a COVID vaccine in 1 year. Finally, we still don't have an ambassador nominated to replace me yet. I get calls or emails from my friends in Seoul regularly on this. Many of them know that I offered to stay on for 6 months or so until a new ambassador was named. However, it's been over a year since our election. I tell my friends that this is emblematic of the divided political landscape in America in the 2020s. I call this legislative malpractice. But in this case, we can't blame the Senate since the White House hasn't even nominated someone. I'm disappointed. We need a nominee named and then confirmed quickly. Thanks, and I'll stop here and stand by for your questions after General Abrams talks.
Thank you. Abe?
Okay, Skip, thanks. Let me start by saying I echo the thanks of the fellow panel members to the Korea Society for hosting this signature policy event. Having changed command 4 months ago and entered the retired roles 2 short months ago, this is my first real opportunity to speak publicly about the ROK-US alliance and the situation on the Korean Peninsula as a private citizen. And thanks to General Sharp and the Korea Society for inviting me to participate with these all-star panel members. I'm particularly pleased to be teamed up again with Ambassador Harris, as we were the U.S. Paul Mill team in Korea for over 2 years, worked hand in hand every day to strengthen the alliance and support our nation's objectives. I want to say up front that commanding United Nations Command, Combined Forces Command, and U.S. Forces Korea was the honor of my 39-year career, and serving in Korea was special. We made many dear friends and developed a love for the Korean people and the Korean culture. We miss them, and we miss Korea. My role today is to really zoom in the lens and focus on the military dimension of the alliance and the situation on the Korean Peninsula, where we have opportunities and where we have some challenges. While the security situation between the ROK-US alliance and North Korea and the peninsula is stable, and the terms of the 1953 Armistice Agreement continue to preserve this stability, there is growing instability and tension in Northeast Asia that directly affects the peninsula. I'd note here for all of you that the Armistice Agreement is the only internationally recognized legal instrument preventing a resumption of hostilities from occurring on the peninsula. And it's been effective since its signing on 27 July 1953 after 2 years of long, difficult negotiations. No one at the time thought the Armistice Agreement would have to endure for over 68 years, but here we are. Look no further than the Korean Peninsula to see clear examples of the strategic competition that Admiral Swift spoke of. And in my view, the chief competitor is China. And China is the principal driver of instability in the region as they attempt to rewrite the international rules-based order into something else. For instance, China has increased their violations of the Korea Air Defense Identification Zone by 300% over the last 3 years with both combat and reconnaissance aircraft. We've seen a significant increase in Chinese fishing vessels in the always contentious Northwest Islands this year, and for the first time in many years, several Chinese vessels were detained by the Korean Coast Guard this year for wrongfully fishing in Korean waters. In the last 12 months, China and Russia have conducted combined combat air operations circumnavigating the Korean Peninsula. There's also been a significant increase of Chinese aircraft and naval vessels in vicinity of Japanese and Taiwan sovereign territory, and that's been going on for a couple of years and has reached all-time high in the last 4 months. China continues to punish and issue veiled threats to the Republic of Korea over the U.S. THAAD battery deployment in 2017, despite numerous explanations of the defensive nature of THAAD and its radar. China has the Republic of Korea in an economic chokehold and applies pressure whenever it suits their needs. And lastly, China continues to directly and indirectly support violation of UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea. All of that to say that China's ambition to be a regional hegemon is not limited, and anyone who thinks that Korea is somehow immune to Chinese subterfuge needs to pay closer attention to what is happening on a daily basis. I was encouraged to see recent Korean polling that reflected the Korean people now recognize this destabilizing and detrimental behavior by China and gave China the most negative rating, lower than North Korea and Japan. The U.S.-ROC alliance has stood strong for 71 years despite many challenges and changes to the security environment over time. We say, our bumper sticker, that the alliance is ironclad, but having served there for 32 months as the commander, my assessment is that the alliance is much, much more than that. While it was born in the shared hardship and sacrifices in the crucible of ground combat during the Korean War, it has evolved significantly beyond the military domain and includes shared values, a democratic form of government, and commitment to the international rules-based order. The U.S.-ROC military relations are as strong as they have ever been, and it is a relationship of mutual trust and respect. It is unbreakable. ROC U.S. military readiness is the single strongest deterrent to any North Korean miscalculation, misunderstanding, or potential adventurism. No one in this audience should need to be reminded that it was North Korea who initiated the hostilities on 25 June 1950 by attacking into South Korea. Since the signing of the Armistice Agreement in July 1953, North Korea has conducted hundreds of unprovoked hostile actions against both the ROC and U.S., which constitute major violations of the Armistice Agreement, and has resulted in numerous ROC and U.S. deaths, not only along the demilitarized zone in the northern limit line, but in the Republic of Korea and international waters and airspace, including the sinking of the Chonan and the downing of a manned U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. I would also add that North Korea has twice attempted to assassinate the Korean president. While the last 3 years have seen a palpable reduction in tension on the peninsula and a reduction in these unprovoked aggressive attacks, history tells us that North Korea's behavior can change on no notice, and aggression is their modus operandi. If someone was looking for an example of what is an actual hostile policy, I'd say North Korea's policy towards the Republic of Korea and the United States is as good an example as you will find. The mission of the ROC U.S. Combined Forces Command is to defend the Republic of Korea against North Korean aggression, with emphasis on defense. Like every other country in alliance, our militaries conduct training to ensure our forces are prepared to defend. Training is a routine activity for any sovereign nation's military to defend itself. While we don't need to have our sword out continuously due to the current reduction in tensions, that does not mean that we should not pull our sword out periodically and keep it sharp. Since February of 2019, the ROC U.S. Alliance has adjusted the size, scope, volume, and timing of its combined training to provide a more suitable atmosphere for diplomacy. I would add here that the armed forces of North Korea, on the other hand, the Korea People's Army, have kept up their semi-annual summer and winter training cycles at the same level as the last 5 years, with some limitations in 2020 due to the emergence of COVID and North Korea's subsequent lockdown of the country to prevent the spread. However, as strong as the alliance is, there are several lingering issues that continue to hamper the trajectory of the alliance and readiness. And that list includes routine access to live fire facilities for both ground forces and attack aviation, night firing in particular, and adequate airspace for training of our combat air crews. Unfettered access to the THAAD battery site, United Nations Command, roles, mission, and authorities, and general misinformation of the bilaterally agreed to conditions-based OPCON transition plan and its status. I'm hopeful these longstanding issues can be resolved through continued dialogue and coordination with relevant U.S. and ROC entities so the alliance can better focus its attention on the shared challenges that we face. Lastly, North Korea's possession of nuclear weapons and solid fuel ballistic missiles capable of ranging all of Korea, most of Japan, and potentially the U.S. homeland casts a dark cloud over the entire region. Can we ever envision North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons? Most experts that I've spoken with or I've read their analysis say unequivocally, no. I agree with them. We should judge North Korea by their actions and not their words. Since the signing of the South-North Declaration on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in 1992, how many agreements regarding North Korea's illicit weapons program has North Korea failed to live up to or have outright nullified? Too many to count. In fairness, despite numerous violations of the Armistice Agreement over the years, North Korea does generally abide by the stipulations of the armistice agreement and respects their constraints of the demilitarized zone and the northern limit line. North Korea has also generally abided by the conditions of the 2018 Inter-Korean Comprehensive Military Agreement, with a couple of notable exceptions. Following the summit in Hanoi in February of 2019, where North Korea did not get any sanctions relief, in my view, we've witnessed a 2-year-long North Korean temper tantrum, a ballistic and cruise missile testing, harsh rhetoric towards both the United States and the Republic of Korea, more threats of aggression, severing of inter-Korean communication lines, the destruction of the Korean liaison office in Kaesong, and the launch of a submarine-launched ballistic missile. I'd say those are indicators that North Korea is not really interested in continuing to reduce tension, build trust, and lessen the chance for mistakes or accidents that could quickly flare up and restart hostilities, unless it involves the real issue, the lifting of sanctions. As I said earlier, we should judge North Korea by its actions and not its words. We should ask ourselves collectively, is peaceful existence with a nuclear weapon-armed North Korea an acceptable outcome? Most people would say no. I agree with them. And that brings us to the decades-long argument, do we seek nuclear disarmament of North Korea first, then peace, or establish peace first, and then seek the dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear weapons program? There are strong views on both sides of this argument, and we are seeing this being debated once again by U.S. and Korean counterparts at various levels. Of course, all options are dependent on North Korea's willingness to engage in dialogue, which they have recently said they will not do until certain conditions are met. North Korea would be more than happy to allow us to negotiate with ourselves. If history is prologue, we know that North Korea will attempt to gain as many concessions as they can before engaging in any serious discussions, and even then, the North Korean track record for living up to their commitments is pretty poor. In the meantime, the status quo has prevented the restart of hostilities on the peninsula for 68 years, and the Republic of Korea has become a thriving liberal democracy with the 9th or 10th largest GDP in the world, a world leader in managing the pandemic, along with many, many other achievements. Continued diplomatic efforts are the best way forward to address North Korea and its nuclear weapons program and establishing a permanent peace. And all of that must be supported by a strong, vigilant military presence that prevents any miscalculation or misunderstanding by North Korea that the ROK-U.S. alliance has become weak and incapable of defending and protecting the Korean people. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks. Let's give a round of applause for all these great introductions. We've got some really good questions that have come in, and I'm going to divide the questions kind of as we have done so far. Talk initially about some strategic questions that have come in about the region, and then look at, on the peninsula from both a diplomatic and a military perspective. And I'd ask all of the different panelists to feel free to chime in as we go through here. The first ones revolve around the question of strategic competition, and specifically in the area of what China is doing. You all three have laid out some very specifics about what China is doing, not only in Korea, but in the entire AOR. And so the questions are all over what should be the response to that? And the response from, we could take it maybe, economically, Harry, diplomatically, and militarily. How does the alliance respond to some of the elements that you all have laid out of what China is trying to do to influence specifically the Korean Peninsula?
So a great question, and obviously don't have the time to cover it totally because it's such a complex issue, but let me make these points. I wrote an article recently that was focused on Taiwan, and unbeknownst to me, I was one of 5 folks that were responding. 2 of the others being Susan Thornton and Bonnie Glazier, who I have the utmost respect for. And the question was, will China invade Taiwan? And all 5 of the respondents, we didn't compare notes, we didn't know each other was writing on it, responded in the same way that we have to take a diplomatic approach, and we have to take an inclusive approach to include all those that, as I said in my comments, have skin in the game. That has to be backed up by the demonstrative commitment that comes with the application of military power. I use the mechanism as a point of departure, sharing Queen Elizabeth's deployment and the context of that deployment in complete alignment with the international rules-based order, with all those nations competing, contributing to it, doing so in a way that bolstered their diplomatic message. So first of all, I think we need to lead with democracy. I go back to take it back to a Korean issue of when Secretary Mattis was Secretary of Defense. He continued to say, when Secretary Tillotson was Secretary of State, that we're dealing with a very difficult North Korean problem in particular then, that Mattis would continually say the DoD is in support of state. So that's an important element to consider. We need to do it with state in the lead. They are the ones that deal with foreign policy issues. The second is that we need to do it collectively, and you've heard all 3 of us speak about this. I'll close on this point. It's an easier question to answer about what not to do. And so General Abrams mentioned this point, and it's one thing that I'll take this opportunity to comment on, and that is the combined training that occurs on PEN. There is nothing more critical in the context of deterrence than the relevance of that deterrence in the calculation of those that you're trying to deter. You can use economic deterrence, you can use diplomatic deterrence, you can use military deterrence. But in the context of military deterrence, unless that force is relevant in the eyes of those that you're trying to deter, it has minimal deterrence value. The key from a military perspective in ensuring that that force is relevant and ready is training. You are decreasing the deterrent value of the American U.S. policy and Korean policy on the peninsula by diminishing the demonstrative effect of conducting training in an open and transparent way. So in answer, go back to my original comments and direct answer to the question, I would just stress part of that question is also what are the things that we shouldn't do? And we should be very careful about diminishing things like training, those systems that have served us so well in history.
Correct. Thanks. Harry, thoughts?
Yeah, I'll be as quick as I can. I believe that diplomatically, we have to hold the PRC accountable in all the international fora that we're all members of, whether it's the United Nations, the IAEA, all of the fora that we're all a part of. We should hold the PRC accountable in those venues. George Shultz, great Secretary of State, he once said that I'm a great believer that strength and diplomacy go together. It's never one or the other. And I think that's the right approach. You have to have diplomacy backed by military strength. And that's what we have. I believe in that, and I think we need to continue that model. Diplomatically, I've already talked about the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that's a good beginning from which to evolve and develop a strategy that the United States can stand on our principles and call for those things that I mentioned in my remarks. And finally, I'll just ask the question and then try to answer it. Will the PRC invade Taiwan? So CFR's Professors Blackwell and Zelikow, they've said that that is imminent, that the PRC will invade Taiwan imminently. And then Admirals Davidson and Aquilino have talked about a 6-year timeline. Now, with regard to that 6-year timeline, I've been asked a lot about that lately. And what I've said about it is that these two admirals, Admiral Davidson, who took my place, and Admiral Aquilino, who took his place, they're not outsiders looking in. And they have access to the full range of intelligence that I don't have access to anymore. And so I believe that they should be taken seriously, and I think we as a nation should sit up and take notice when our commanders in the Pacific say that China is going to potentially invade Taiwan in a certain time frame. I'll stop there.
Thanks. And Abe, on the military side, and as you address this, a question came in that relates to that on the recent announcement that China aims to triple their size of their nuclear arsenal and the effect of that, on the peninsula, and how do we, for the deterrence value of what needs to be done with the alliance.
Sure. Well, first off, any country growing its nuclear weapons inventory ought to be concerning to everybody across the entire international community. And, certainly the United States and Russia, that's fundamentally what was behind START, right, was about reducing our nuclear weapons stockpile. How many do you really need to achieve the effect that you're looking for? So this should be very concerning to everyone, in addition to building their own version of a triad. As it relates to the Korean Peninsula, though, what I'd say is since its inception, the U.S. extended deterrent for the Republic of Korea is ironclad. It's guaranteed. It is it's not one that should be questioned. There's been a lot of chatter lately about whether the Republic of Korea should develop its own nuclear weapons program. I'm not in favor of that. I think that would be a bad idea. There's a lot of unmentioned costs that go towards building a nuclear weapons program that I'm not sure has been well thought out, but frankly, it's unnecessary. And it could potentially lead to misunderstanding and miscalculation by not just North Korea, but other people in the region. The U.S. extended deterrent has been, every year it's reiterated at every strategic dialogue between the United States and the Republic of Korea. We reiterate that commitment of an extended deterrence. And our extended deterrence is our U.S. strategic forces are the best on the planet. And as the commander in Korea, I had the utmost confidence in our strategic capability.
Great. We'll do one more question on Taiwan, and then we'll move on to North Korea. And I'll ask Carrie to only respond to this since she brought it up. How can we extend strategic clarity to Taiwan if we don't even recognize their government?
Yeah, so that's two areas, and I'm not going to get into the issue of whether we should recognize Taiwan again. I believe that the American policy, or one China policy, is a good policy. It has stood the test of time. We have also had this policy of strategic ambiguity with regard to Taiwan, and I believe that while it has served us well for the last 50 years or so, is no longer the best policy. When I talk about strategic clarity, that is as much about the PRC as it is Taiwan and the rest of the region. I believe we need to be clear on what would happen if the PRC invaded Taiwan. I believe we owe that to the Taiwan people. I think we owe it to our own people, and we owe it to the PRC for there to be clarity as to what the United States would do. As you all know, certainly the person who asked the question knows better than me. Our relationship with Taiwan is governed by the law, the Taiwan Relations Act, and I believe that we should take that, and we do take that completely seriously, our obligations under the law. So I'll stop there.
Add to that,
Yes,
Skip,
sure.
just to that last point that Harry made. I completely agree that we take it seriously, but our approach is ambiguous. I'm not going to go there talking about the strategic ambiguity strategy. I think the process that we have in place is sufficient. But if you're talking about a strategic competition, it's dangerous to be ambiguous because someone will miscalculate somewhere. There's another point and I actually have been heartened by some of the language that's come out of this administration in an attempt to clarify that within the construct of the current characterization of the relationship. The other point that I'll make on this point of clarity, it's interesting as listening to all of us speak, I'm trying to break myself of the habit of saying China and trying to say more and more PRC. The article that I spoke about, Will China invade Taiwan? It's on a website, shoot, in fact, I've got a China file, chinafile.com, and so I would invite you to take a look at it, mainly because of the folks that wrote on it. But in that article, my response was, it depends. And in the comment, I'm not sure China understands when exactly, PRC would understand exactly when they would invade Taiwan. But the reason I prefer Harry's model of talking about PRC instead of China, because China's not the problem, because you're talking about all the Chinese people. And I've got many friends in China, and you tend to vilify them, which plays into the hands of the PRC. PRC is an extension of the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping, despite what recently happened as continued centralization of his own power, still struggles with the Chinese Communist Party and their support of him. It is all about the Chinese Communist Party. If the Chinese Communist Party decides it's in their best interest to invade Taiwan, they will. That's where strategic ambiguity, I think, puts us at risk. I'll stop there.
Great. Let's move to North Korea now. And you all kind of talked about this, but I'd like to expand a little bit on it. You know, there's people both in the United States and in South Korea that advocate, that says, in order to get to a goal, you got to start with trust. So you got to build trust first. You got to do things, and then both sides will trust, and then you can move on to the harder things to be able to get to the final end state, to the goals that you want. There's other folks that believe, show me some solid actions, then I will trust you, and then we can move all forward as we go down the line. So examples such as, you know, sanctions, reduction of military exercises, an end of war declaration type of thing. Some people are advocating that those, if we do those first, then trust will go within North Korea. There'll be dialogue, and we'll be able to move towards denuclearization. Other people have pointed out that you can't trust North Korea. They got to do some actions first, and then we'll gain trust. Then we'll be able to continue down that path. Where do you all fall out on this sequencing, in this trust versus actions in the sequencing of it? As I think, especially all of those, but especially the end of war declaration, that's kind of that's one of the arguments to be able to do that. And Abe, I think I'll start with you being the most recent out of there.
Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we ought to judge North Korea by its actions and not its words. And, you know, over the last 30 years, we have tried multiple times. We have tried this approach. We've tried it north to south, south to north, inter-Korean. We've tried it U.S. to North Korea. We've tried all three, whereby we gave and North Korea did not reciprocate. That the trust never came back. And then, in fact, you know, back in the 90s, right, they agreed, and then they refused to allow any inspectors in to be able to begin to take initial looks at their nuclear weapons program, and then they outright nullified the 92 North-South Declaration. So we, look, nobody wants war again on the Korean Peninsula less than me. I mean, as a soldier, that's the last thing we want. But to get there, we should be clear-eyed and pragmatic. And again, I agree, it should be led by diplomacy. But I agree with Harry. Giving away things is not the right approach. On the end of war declaration, you know, this is not, you know, the most recent discussion about the end of war declaration. That's not new, right? At least for the last 15 years, and certainly it was part of the summitry back in 2018. You know, that declaration, this is my issue. A declaration of end of war is not an end state or an objective unto itself, but rather a way to achieve that end state. And we ought to be really careful and proceed deliberately. And because what's not clear is what end state are we aiming for by this initial step of declaring an end of war. You know, is it a peace treaty or is it denuclearization? We haven't answered that question yet. And we have not, since 2006, when this end of war declaration first came up, we still haven't come to agreement on the sequencing. There's strong voices on the other side. Some people say it's, you know, it's sort of, you know, it's symbolic and has no specific legal meaning or tangible outcome. I'm not convinced. If you just go to the summitry of 2018, the Panmunjom Declaration, that was a component. North Korea, though, has failed to fully come forward in a North-South declaration of end of war, and we ought to ask why. And I think it's because, and North Korea has sort of shown their cards recently what the real issue is. It's symbolic, and there are no tangible effects on the ground which would, address North Korea's unwarranted security concerns. So we ought to be really mindful about what it can mean and what it can't. There is a body of evidence that once there is an end of war declaration, there will be calls in the United Nations Security Council with an end of war to rescind previous UN Security Council resolutions 82, 83, 84, and 85. So what does that mean? Well, UN Security Council Resolution 84 activated a unified command under U.S. leadership to lead the defense of the Republic of Korea. And 2 weeks ago, the North Korean ambassador to the UN asked once again to abolish United Nations Command. Well, if you abolish United Nations Command, what's the premise of the armistice agreement? We would back our way into dissolving the only internationally recognized legal instrument that has prevented the resumption of hostilities on the peninsula. I think that is not risk. I think that's a gamble, and we ought to proceed very carefully.
Right. Any other thoughts, Scott?
Yeah, I would say this. Trust is a critical, I would suggest, and often lecture on this, is the most critical element of any relationship, personal or professional. The thought that came to my mind is trust but verify. That applied in a time when Russia was clearly on its way out and we could afford as a nation to take risk. That is not the condition where North Korea is, especially with the PRC support that they enjoy now. I would say it'd be verify first and then trust. I think Abe has it exactly right.
And Skip, I just add, not only with that question that the North Korean ambassador has already broached recently, but I think there would be a lot of questions about, well, if we've declared an end of war, why do we need Combined Forces Command, whose only mission is to defend the Republic of Korea against North Korean aggression? So if the war is over, why would we need Combined Forces Command? I think we've got to sort of spin this around and take more of a traditional approach that's not gambling, but still delivers that same commitment. And that is, perhaps, as we know, the Armistice Agreement was a military-only agreement, right, 1953. Never publicly endorsed by any other governments per se, but it was a military agreement. How about this? How about we get a political statement of the parties that reaffirms their commitment to the armistice agreement? Make that the starting point, that we end all hostilities, that we're going to withdraw our forces, that we're going to establish this era and era of no conflict, and then make a commitment towards peace and denuclearization. And then they'll have to still argue about what's the sequencing.
Right. As a follow-on to that, in a certain way, is the nuclear issue. We've seen reports lately that North Korea is, considering deploying tactical nuclear weapons. They continue to build their missile and their nuclear capability. But on the other side, we have continued questions about the nuclear umbrella, those that we have promised to the Republic of Korea. Those discussions have grown with the no first use discussions for the next NPR. And just where are you all on this balance of nuclear clarity as to to be able to respond to that versus what North Korea is doing, and should there be any changes to our policies as we go now? And as a side to that, if you want to jump on this at the end, Abe, talk just a little bit about missile defense in South Korea and whether the capabilities that we have there and whether we need more there.
I'll be quick. I think Harry and Abe's insights are more meaningful here, but I talk often about needing to tap the brakes when people are kind of headed off in a direction that hasn't been fully thought. I think we need to set the brake on this one. I am very skeptical at any discussion about anybody going down the nuclear path. It certainly is very troublesome from a North Korean perspective, but even with our allies and partners and friends, I think it's this extension of this trust in the United States, that has eroded, certainly, and I wouldn't say just over the last 4 years, it's been longer than that. This focus on foreign policy from the perspective of national defense, not just of the United States, but more broadly. I think that's where Secretary Austin is coming from this collective defense, but I'll defer to Harry and Abe for specifics on the peninsula.
So on the issue of tactical nukes, American tactical nukes back in Korea, I'm completely opposed to it. I think that the idea of America's strategic umbrella extended to South Korea is the right answer. And if you don't trust our strategic umbrella, then why would you trust us with our nuclear weapons in South Korea? So I think that answers those questions from my perspective. I'm a strong proponent of maintaining and strengthening our strategic deterrent capability to our ally, South Korea. I'm strongly opposed to reintroduction of American tactical nuclear weapons on the peninsula.
Any comments on no first use?
Oh, yeah. On no first use, I think that would be a mistake of enormous magnitude.
Again, as I said earlier, Skip, as the commander, right, as the operational warfighting commander in Korea for 32 months, I have, and I still have, 100% confidence in our nuclear umbrella. Our strategic forces are well-trained, well-equipped, well-rehearsed, excellent coordination with supported commanders around the globe. And we have gone to great lengths, and there's been adjustments in our defense strategic dialogues over the years to include this as a working group underneath the umbrella of defense talks. So the coordination is there. It's well understood. And like I said, of all the capabilities at my disposal as the CFC commander, that one, we never had to worry about that capability.
Okay. So one more question on North Korea, then we'll move to CFC, and this, Abe, I'll just send this to you. Any indication that North Korea is modernizing their conventional forces in any aspects as they do continue to modernize their missile force and their nuclear force?
So I think we've seen some examples, right, over the last year, parades and other things of development activities. But as I reminded audiences when I was in Korea, we should not confuse equipment that's trotted out as a parade as demonstrated capability. Some of that, I think, was aspirational. It may be on their drawing board, but clearly, and again, this is a subset of the effects of sanctions, they've put Kim Jong-un, since he's taken over, he has made a huge turn in North Korea's investment for the defense forces, and it's primarily been in solid fuel missiles, nuclear weapons, special operations forces, and cyber. That's where he's put his money in. And, the conventional forces, while we've seen some examples, parade quality examples of capability, we've yet to see signs that that's been fielded operationally.
Okay, we now move to CFC and United Nations Command, the President in the future. And again, Abe, you discussed on this, but can you expand a little bit about when you think, or not when, when and what the conditions need to be in place for UPCON transition to actually take place, and kind of the current status of it,
Yep.
or at least as it was when you left a couple months ago?
Sure. So this whole topic of UPCON transition, depending upon who you talk to, and it's been discussed since maybe '87. It certainly picked up a lot of steam in the late '90s and early 2000s, and one of our predecessors, B.B. Bell, back in 2008 testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee and said, hey, they're ready right now. And, let's execute. So to be clear, a Korean general should command Korean forces in the defense of the Republic of Korea. There's no ambiguity about that. But we had a time-based plan, and we had 3 different timelines. And as we got within a year of each time when they were supposed to assume operational control of their forces, leadership in the Republic of Korea said, we're not ready. We're not ready. Okay, so that's what transformed the discussion, circa 2012-13 timeframe, into, okay, let's develop a conditions-based plan. So today, we have bilaterally agreed conditions. Took 2 years to negotiate these conditions, by the way. And it is a complicated plan. And I don't claim to be the expert, but when I left Korea, I would say I was in the top 3 of people who understand how that plan was created and what it really means. And part of the challenge for the public is that plan is classified because the conditions are tied to Korean acquisition of critical military capabilities. The preponderance of the bilaterally agreed to plan is directly tied to Korea acquiring those critical military capabilities to demonstrate that they can lead the combined defense. And oh, by the way, be much less reliant on U.S. forces in the defense of the Republic of Korea. That is the basic premise of the bilaterally agreed to conditions-based OPCON transition plan. So, that was signed in 2015. So as time has gone by, the Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense, they've got a punch list of numerous critical military capabilities that they've got to bring online. And as I've said, I don't think they made much progress for the first couple of years of the plan. 2019 and beyond, we've seen huge investment by the government into the Ministry of National Defense budget. We've seen a big turn in acquisition, but acquisitions take time. And so we're several years from Korea acquiring all the critical military capabilities that are associated with the plan. And so people ask, well, what about the scheduling of the next certification event for this ROC-led Combined Forces Command? Well, over the last 2 years, what we found is that that small aspect, and that is an aspect of the plan to prepare, to put a Korean 4-star in command of Combined Forces Command. But it's a very small part. That was outpacing the acquisition plan. So what we've done now is we've harmonized the next scheduled certification event will be at an appropriate time based on their acquisitions, because it makes more sense to do those certification events much closer to when these capabilities will come online. And so that's why I say, it'll be several years before we fully meet those conditions.
Yeah, I'll follow on because some of the dates that you pointed out, I was involved in that version of OPCON transition, both on the Joint Staff before I went to Korea, then when I went to Korea. I think it's useful to look back and say, okay, in the 2008 to 2011 time period, we had a plan to do OPCON transition. But what OPCON transition was back then was totally different than what it is right now from a command and control structure perspective. And I believe it's gotten a lot better what it is now. But just very briefly, when I was a commander back there, the idea was to disband Combined Forces Command, have a Korea, the ROC JCS would be the overall commander. He'd be the supported, in military language, he'd be the supported command, and the supporting command would be what we call back then CORECOM, KoreaCom, the U.S. forces tucked up underneath there. Some of the reason that went away, thanks to J.D. Thurman and others afterwards, was because we really realized that we have such a significant capability within Combined Forces Command that really is unique anywhere in the world. To be able to truly have a command that is a binational command that has singular purpose, and to be able to work together and does it on a daily basis as we go through. And even after OPCON transition, whenever it happens in the future, people really have to understand that it's not the Republic of Korea in charge. There is a Republic of Korea general that is the commander of the new Combined Forces Command, but that general reports to both nations through a mechanism called the Military Consultative Committee and the Security. So he works for both nations, takes orders from both nations as we go forward. I mean, just to give you an example, when I was a commander, we reworked several very big plans when I was a commander. I'll just leave it at that. In order to get those plans approved, I spent more time with the Korean Minister of Defense than I did with the U.S. Secretary of Defense, because both countries had to approve the changes of the plans. And that's how the construct will continue to move as we move in the future. One last thing on OPCON, I'm watching timing here, is the condition in North Korea, the condition on the peninsula from provocation, things that are going on. How does that play into, in your mind, the timing of OPCON
Yeah,
transition?
sure. So that's condition 3, right? Is the situation on the peninsula conducive to making the change? And that's actually one aspect of the bilaterally agreed to plan, where we have pretty clear metrics between the two nations' intelligence enterprises to be able to make that assessment, and that is that's updated frequently. So, and I don't want to, we're not. I'm not cleared, nor is anybody else, and I'm signed off now. But I'm comfortable in saying that that's actually a pretty clear metric, and it's something that we track frequently and have great dialogue and consultation between the two sides in determining whether the situation on the peninsula is about right. Hey, Skip, I don't want to drag this one on though. Of course, I knew that General Sharp was the commander when we were actually on the cusp of making this transition, which would have disestablished, inactivated Combined Forces Command. And he and I have talked about the pros and cons of such an approach. So if my only comment is that the military distinction of what he just said is significant. It won't matter much in civilian minds, but this idea of supporting is a huge military distinction. And it relates to how much more risk are you willing to assume, how much risk to mission, and risk to the force. And in this case, I'd say risk to Korea, the Korean people, under a supporting relationship versus working under one unified military operational command that responds to binational authority. And that's why the decision was made to keep a CFC combined forces structure. And in 2018, at the Security Consultative Meeting, Secretary Mattis and the Minister of Defense agreed we should keep CFC as an entity, and we would just change the nationality of the commander. But that was a risk decision. So as this gets debated, right, and some people are in a hurry, we ought to ask ourselves, well, if you're in a hurry, then maybe we need to take that old system and bring it back on the table and have a conversation about advantages and disadvantages. But the military distinction is if you go to a time-based plan, then we're going to have to go back to that old construct of a CORCOM and a ROC JCS, ROC chairman-led ROC Armed Forces. And for those of you who don't know, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Republic of Korea in wartime already wears 4 hats. This would be a 5th hat.
We got time for about 2 more questions. Then this one's an interesting one. It comes from the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies. Why don't we have a NATO-like organization in Asia. Is it possible? Would it be beneficial if we did? You talked about the Australian, UK, and so to everybody, from a PACOM commander perspective.
Yeah, I'll start it. I'm sure that Admiral Swift and General Abrams have opinions on this as well. It'll never work. We tried it at one time, and it was an organization called SEATO, right? Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. That was Thailand, Vietnam, and a couple other countries. It did not work. The rivalries and the histories of the countries in the Indo-Pacific, in my opinion, are such that you could never get country A to agree to a military alliance to defend country B against an attack by country C. I just don't see that happening. So rather than trying to expend our intellectual energies and national treasuries on trying to form a NATO-like structure in Asia, these coalitions of the willing, like the Quad, is important. The FPDA, the Five Powers Defense Arrangement, of which the United States is not part of. The UK and Australia and other Southeast Asian, Singapore, other Southeast Asian nations are part of that. The PIF, the Pacific Island Forum. These are coalitions of the willing designed to focus on issues that are important to these countries. And I think that's the solution. We do have a new defensive pact in Asia. It's AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK agreement that I talked about in my comments. We are allied already with the UK through NATO. We are allied already with Australia through ANZUS, even though we don't extend treaty protections to New Zealand anymore because of their stance on nuclear-powered warships. And now we have a new arrangement, AUKUS, and I'm a huge fan of it. But to the bigger question of whether we would have a NATO-like structure in Asia, certainly it sounds good, and it might look good on paper, but I think the reality is that it'll never happen.
Yeah, I would agree. I look at ASEAN as an example of critically important organization. They do have
How could I forget ASEAN?
and understandable. So I'm a big believer in ASEAN and how critical they are as a focal point of dialogue based on the who are participants and who are not. So PRC and China are not participants, and I think that has value. They're included in the discussion. They do have a defensive training element to it, which I think is very useful. The PRC participates, the U.S. participates, but our problem in the Indo-Pacific is not excess energy. In the amount of energy that it would take to get a NATO-like entity stood up, it would be very difficult to push in areas that I think are more consequential and important.
And I certainly, when it just comes to the Korean Peninsula, for all the pluses that come along with a NATO-like organization, the bilateral command structure that you already alluded to is ideal between two mutual defense treaty partners. But we already have a coalition of the willing. Skip, you know that,
Called
right?
United Nations.
It's called United Nations Command and United Nations Sending States. UN Security Council Resolution 83, still valid. And, if hostilities, God forbid, were to restart, back in 1950 to 53, we had 22 nations make contributions. But think about where the world was in 1950, right? Most of the world was recovering from World War II. Most countries didn't have the capability. There are many, many more countries who are part of the coalition of the willing, who would be willing to make contributions to the defense of the Republic of Korea, and we've got a standing organization to be able to coordinate with appropriate consultation with the Republic of Korea government to be able to bring them on board in support of alliance operations.
And we practice that.
And we practice it.
One more specific question, then I'll ask each one of the panelists here to kind of wrap with what do you all believe is the kind of the most important thing that we do and maybe not do to get this alliance, keep this alliance as strong as it is, and maybe even strengthen it. So while you're thinking about that, Harry, the recent PRC hypersonic test and satellite test and all of that. What are your thoughts on the dangers and where that all is headed?
Yeah, it's an important question. I'm sure everyone here knows, but there was the PRC tested a hypersonic missile last summer. There was some leaders in Washington first likened it to a Sputnik moment, and then they started to try to walk that back. I think General Hyten had it right when he spoke about it this week. I personally believe that it was a Sputnik moment. In fact, I think it was worse than a Sputnik moment, because if you recall your history, the Soviets then launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, and 4 months later, we successfully launched Explorer 1, our own satellite. So the point of that is that the Soviet program and the American program were pretty close. They got there first, good on them, but shortly thereafter, we launched our program and off we went. We have nothing that's up to the level of hypersonic missile yet. Some estimates I read this morning in the open press, some estimates are that the Army will develop one in about a year or so. But this is worse, in my view, than Sputnik. So I think that's another indication that we, the United States, we need to take this issue seriously. This capability that the PRC has demonstrated, we need to take that seriously, and we need to get our act together and put resources into our own programs.
Great. So start with you, Abe. The most important thing we do or don't do to keep this alliance strong and strengthen it in the future?
Dialogue, constant contact. I can't overstate enough, and it's at every level, right? So if you're in Korea as a U.S. military member, it's something you live and breathe every single day. Not just Combined Forces Command, but we have combined formations in the air component, the Marine component, the Army component. We have the 2nd Infantry Division, for instance. Most people have forgotten this, is a combined headquarters now. There's 170 Korean officers and non-commissioned officers that work in the 2nd Infantry Division headquarters every day. There's an appropriate representation in 8th Army. We have the same across all the components. That day-to-day, that is a daily sign of our commitment. It's an opportunity to continue to maintain our resolve together, clear up any differences. My urge to everyone is we need to have that in every domain, in academia, diplomacy, in the business world. The more we can do together and work together will only strengthen the alliance. When we choose not to, or we work against each other, that's where the erosion of the alliance comes in.
Okay. Scott?
Yeah, I would agree. I would the dialogue I would frame it as a discourse and debate. I think that goes to this next point. Discourse and debate is critically important. I think multilateralism is the approach of choice, although bilateralism is okay because sometimes there's national issues. I think that certainly is appropriate with the Korea discussion here, but not unilateralism. If you end up pursuing a unilateral approach, you have to think of yourself, are our national interests so important that we can't team with somebody else? And the last thing I'll say is, and I tried to capture this in my comments, is to think more broadly about the problem set that we face collectively. So oftentimes, as admirals were asked, the discussion goes down the path of freedom to navigate, and from a maritime perspective. And Harry has spoken much more eloquently on this than I have. But the freedom to navigate is being challenged, not just in the maritime domain, but the diplomatic domain, the information domain, the economic domain across, if you're a military parlance, the dime fill. This is space together that we can come together on and have discussions about. And I'll close on this point. Instead of focusing first where our differences are, let's focus where we have common views. And then from that common view discussion, get into those areas. That's part of the trust building process. start on those areas where we have agreement, and then expand in those areas where we have a lack of agreement.
Okay, great. And Harry?
I'll be brief on this one. I think in addition to continued dialogue, I believe we must continue to resource the alliance, and that's on both countries, South Korea and the United States. We have to continue to resource it, invest in it, and remain committed to it. The danger here, the danger part of the question is that if we take the alliance for granted, and if we take our partnership, our relationship with South Korea for granted and vice versa. You know, if we assume that they'll always be there for us, if they assume that we'll always be there for them, but we don't do the dialogue piece, we don't do the resourcing piece, I think we're on a downward spiral to disaster.
So great conversation today. I personally want to thank each one of the panelists. I think everybody knows time is very valuable, but for these three great leaders to come all the way from Kansas, from Colorado, and from San Diego, or were you in Massachusetts, but long ways away, you know, it's not only the work to get prepared to do this, but it's the time that's involved. But their willingness, I think, speaks volumes to what we all believe, and I think everybody in this room believes, is the importance of the Korea-U.S. alliance, the importance of keeping this alliance strong, and the importance of Korea and the importance of the United States. And, you know, our goal in the Korea Society is to be able to make sure to continue to push to strengthen those relationships and have those relationships understood both here in the United States and in the Republic of Korea. So I thank Tom Byrne and Kathy and where's Jonathan back there? Jonathan back there, the main construct to put all of this together here. But again, thanks to all the panelists for coming. And thank you all for coming too.